Well, thank you so much to Congressman Pocan and Congressman Ellison and the Congressional Progressive Caucus for organizing this important briefing. We are obviously, as has been mentioned, the national conversation on trade has been focused on the TPP, and with good reason, given that we now know what is in the TPP. It's finally been published after 7 years of closed-door negotiations, and there are many concerns around jobs and wages, food safety, medicine prices, financial stability, many of the things that have been talked about. We do think it's important, as has been mentioned, to begin to have more of a conversation about the other trade negotiation that has been going on now for nearly 3 years, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or the TTIP. Obviously, you could look at this and think, wow, this is an opportunity for a different kind of model between the United States and the European Union, two robust democracies that have relatively high standards. That's the, those are the talking points that we hear. But the TTIP, as I mentioned, has been now, there have now been 12 rounds of negotiations, and many of us haven't heard very much about it at all. And in fact, the U.S. Trade Representative and the European Commission are doubling down and saying they intend to conclude it this year, which by the end of the Obama administration, which is, we can have some discussion about how feasible that is, but that is the goal. And so it is very important for us to be paying attention to this now. And I would say that while we could see this as a good opportunity. We think it's important to look first at who has been pushing for the TTIP. Now, this is a project that's been more than 20 years in the making. There's the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, which is made up of the large multinational corporations on both sides of the Atlantic, Business Europe, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that have been pushing for lowering of not really tariffs are a small piece of this. There's already robust free trade between the United States and Europe, and there's already $4 trillion of investment on both sides of the Atlantic. And so what the TTIP has been pushed as is going behind the border into so-called non-tariff barriers. And what can be quite concerning about that is what are those non-tariff barriers? There are regulations, there are public safeguards, public protections, and a set of broad investor rights. Now, the concerns that you'll hear today, they're not knee-jerk reactions against trade agreements or cooperation with Europe. Many of our organizations organized early on and weighed in heavily about how this could be a good opportunity, what a different process for a negotiation would look like, how you could structure what should be in and not in such an agreement to help to raise standards on both sides of the Atlantic, and that it was an opportunity. However, unfortunately, what we saw early on was that those concerns were not taken into account, particularly by the U.S. Trade Representative Office, and we have carefully studied the industry's goals for the TTIP. We've also been to most of the negotiating rounds and have met with the negotiators on both sides. So the first thing I would say in terms of kind of an overview is that the process continues to be the same secretive, biased, industry-biased process that we saw that brought us the TPP and other deals like that. In fact, it's been quite surprising because of pressure on the other side of the Atlantic, the European Union has begun to publish some of its textual proposals. It wasn't at the beginning, but because of pressure from parliamentarians and member states and civil society there, they started to publish their textual proposals, and the U.S. Trade Representative has not followed suit. They have not published anything of their intention. The same trade advisory system that has 500, 600, mostly almost 90% corporate advisors or trade associations are influencing the U.S. positions, while the public and elected officials are not a part of that process. So that biased process inevitably leads to an agenda that the large multinational corporations on both sides of the Atlantic have been pushing, and not an agenda that we see could realistically lead to the upward harmonization of standards. And what we know about the substance now is still of deep concern. We think there are a lot of risks that we need to be paying attention to. Our expert panelists will discuss just some of them. There are many, many. We can't do them all in TTIP 101. But as was mentioned, the controversy on the TPP around investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, which allows foreign corporations to challenge laws outside of our courts in private tribunals and demand taxpayer compensation for those laws. The U.S.'s exposure to ISDS, if they're included in TTIP, would more than quadruple. And the TTIP contemplates going much, much further in terms of an area that they're calling regulatory cooperation, which sounds nice, but could lead to much more corporate influence in our domestic rulemaking, which would provide opportunities for important public safeguards to be delayed, watered down, or derailed, which could have serious implications for lawmakers and regulators at the federal and state levels to be able to respond to new threats to the public safety or the environment. European banks, we know, have been very keen to use TTIP as a way to water down aspects of U.S. financial regulation post-crisis. You may have heard that the U.S. Treasury thus far has not conceded to engage in this regulatory cooperation discussion on financial regulation under the realm of TTIP. We think that's prudent that they're taking that stance, but the same flawed deregulatory market access rules in financial services are part of the TTIP discussion, and they are having that conversation. We also would say that Treasury's position on not having financial regulation as part of regulatory cooperation begs the question: why would we want other important public health, safety, environmental safeguards to be subject to an unaccountable process where, first and foremost, they're being considered through a trade lens as opposed to a lens of how to protect the public? And for anyone concerned about how TPP might undermine Buy American or Buy Local procurement preferences, TTIP represents a much greater threat. It's one of the European Union's biggest offensive goals in the TTIP to eliminate many of those preferences, not just federal, but state and going down into the city level. With all these risks and other to domestic policy making, democracy, and public safeguards, we also need to make sure that we're looking at what the boosters are saying. What are the supposed benefits of this? And I think what we've seen and what we'll hear is that the upside is quite small, if at all. And I think that we need to be paying attention to that as well. So I want to turn it over to go into some of these issues for Dean to start talking about the economic side. Celeste from the AFL-CIO, she can share the labor perspective, how TTIP might impact workers with potentially there are higher labor standards in Europe. Is it feasible that this could harmonize upward? And we'll share some more threats about the ISDS. And Karen Hansen-Kuhn can talk more about the impact on TTIP on food safety and our regulatory standards, as well as the procurement issues that I mentioned and the impact on local economies. So I'll turn it over